Jesus is the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament. So in the Jewish faith, the Messiah was foretold multiple times. There was plenty of prophecies about the Messiah that were told. And anyone in the Jewish faith was expecting the Messiah. Peter, who Jesus is talking to here in the book of Matthew, is a disciple, just like Matthew, who recorded this story, is a disciple of Jesus Christ. These were Jewish men that knew that the Messiah was coming in the Jewish faith, and Jesus was that Messiah. Now, there are still a lot of Jewish people that believe the Messiah has not come yet. Now, let me just kind of sideline on that for just a second. The reason why that is, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons why that is when a lot of typical Jewish people we're talking about practicers of the Jewish faith, the Messiah, they believe, is going to be more of a political and cultural persona. So in other words, when the Messiah comes, he's going to free the Jewish nation from their bondage and their oppression from all other people, basically righting all political, cultural, humanitarian wrongs that have been committed against the Jewish nation and against Israel. And that's what they believe the Messiah is supposed to be. However, if you look in the Old Testament at the prophecies about Messiah, what you see is that there's actually a much, much larger problem than cultural persecution, political persecution, religious persecution, governmental persecution. There's a much, much bigger problem than that, and that is you and I and our personal sin and our personal bondage to sin, which has nothing to do with external circumstances, which we know. I mean, you can be someone who, I talk about this all the time, you can be someone who is a free, wealthy, Hollywood celebrity, political figure, billionaire, whatever, and still be absolutely horribly miserable and suicidal and drug addicted. Because what's going on inside your soul is far more important than your external circumstances. And I think a lot of the traditional Jewish people looked at the Messiah being someone to come and solve external circumstances, but no, he came to solve the real problem, which is the condition of your soul. And so, as we look at this year of Jubilee, let's look at Jesus himself, because as a Christian, as a born-again, believing Christian, that the Lord Jesus Christ is the Son of God, is the Messiah, I do not look at the Old Testament as worthless and useless. No, useless. You have to understand the purpose. Jesus did not come to destroy or undermine or mock or disrespect the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the books of the law of Moses, okay, the typical Jewish faith. He did not come to disrespect that, to crush that, to destroy that. He came to fulfill it, because Jesus is the law of Moses. Jesus is the great I am. Jesus is the Messiah. So he actually is the physical embodiment of the law, of the Old Testament. Testament means covenant. So this is the covenant that God had with his people. And then Jesus ushers in and completes that covenant to now create the new covenant that God has with his people. Now, with that in mind, and I was going to look at the Bible verses for this, but there's too many. There's just too many. We'll be here all day. But if you look in the New Testament at the description, even in the Old Testament, especially the prophet Isaiah, but if you look even in the New Testament, the words of Jesus himself, and then the words of the disciples, the apostles, the early Christians, and the early church leaders, if you look at all they have to say about Jesus, all these words that they describe Jesus as, and they describe your life now as a believer, is exactly the description of the year of Jubilee back in Leviticus.